This is Storytelling for Developers. Let's go. In my mind, what really separates a junior or intermediate developer from a staff or principal developer is the ability to craft a compelling narrative and to use storytelling to inspire others to help rally around a shared vision. A good example of this can be seen in Dropbox's Levels Guide. As early as L3, which we might consider to be an intermediate level developer, soft skills are highly prized as a measure of competence. As something of a software engineering manager myself, I couldn't agree more. In my experience, when I'm hiring for a team or building out a new team, I kind of realize that hard skills, like knowing a programming language's syntax at a professional level, easier to hire for than finding developers with exceptional soft skills, like a history of coaching and helping others to grow around them. I'm not implying at all that programming is easy, but what I am saying is that soft skills just aren't taught in the same way and are kind of harder to come across, especially in earlier phases of the career path. Someone going out of their way to grow their soft skills requires a pretty dedicated approach, pretty intentional study. Let's dig into the importance of soft skills by looking at examples of expectations of an L3 developer at Dropbox. Here's some examples from their Levels Guide. I proactively ask for feedback, I have self-awareness, I drive discussions with my manager about aspirational goals, things like this. These are some pretty important habits that can help someone to develop their career. A real misconception out there is that managers are somehow obligated to drive the career growth of people who report to them. This isn't really the case. It's a manager's role to make sure people are in the best possible position to succeed, but it's really the responsibility to actually succeed that's up to each individual. It's kind of like an expedition to Mount Everest. A manager is basically a servant leader, like on Everest, who operates at base camp with a radio, a pair of binoculars, and helps to take care of the bigger picture, like making sure climbers have help up the mountain with ropes and other safety gear. But each climber has to be capable of summiting on their own. Even more interesting are the cultural expectations in the Dropbox Levels Guide. Here's some examples. I build relationships. I proactively communicate. I contribute to a positive sense of community. I listen to different perspectives. I tailor my message. I proactively share information. In any development role, there's certainly expectations that someone knows the trade craft of software development, like how to code, debug, test, and deploy. But those hard skills are basically expected. What's kind of unexpected is working with someone, especially someone in the early phases of their career, who have exceptional soft skills combined with that technical tradecraft. It's sort of this unexpected surprise that can help fuel someone's career and take it to the next level. One of the most critical soft skill topics to understand in technology is best summarized by Stephen Covey's The Circle of Control, Influence, and Concern that he outlines in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Topics in your circle of control are tasks or projects that you can control personally, you can deliver on directly, like a bug fix or a feature in the backlog. Early in your career, this circle will be pretty small and probably largely guided by others. I kind of call this the circle of tradecraft. Your circle of influence contains topics and initiatives that are outside of your direct control, but that you can use your influence to affect the outcome of. For example, you might not have the ability to start a new project on your own or decide to use a totally different programming language that you happen to prefer, but with enough trust you can put together a proposal and to get others to start to review that proposal, and maybe they can help to greenlight next steps, assuming they trust your opinion. This is basically the circle of trust. Your circle of concern contains topics that you might be passionate about, but that you might have no direct ability to control or influence. Leveling up in the organization is usually the best way to grow your circle of influence and start moving topics from your circle of concern to your circle of influence and eventually into your control. This is basically the circle of self-awareness. Without it, you might spend too much time here and there kind of chipping away on things that you can't move forward. And that actually can reduce your influence by losing the trust of those around you. Any topic outside of these circles are things that someone doesn't and shouldn't care about at all. This is kind of like the RB Dragons area of a map. With enough self-awareness, you can become aware of things that you shouldn't waste effort and time on, and instead focus on the things that you can help to build trust around, gain influence with your peers in a positive way. Building this kind of self-awareness is a core part of developing soft skills. We can see even more evidence of how important this topic is when looking at Dropbox's expectations of a senior principal engineer. Here are some examples. I help to break down silos. I build deep cross-functional relationships. I develop compelling messages. I fine-tune my approach to getting buy-in and influencing stakeholders. A lot of people falsely assume that these are the skills of a manager, but the delta between management and senior technical leadership is actually more about what people spend their time on, not so much what they're capable of. As a technical manager, I've spent decades already coding. Now I lean on the senior and principal level developers I work with to guide me in the right technical direction, so I can spend my time subtracting distractions from my team, rather than myself submitting pull requests. If this all works out, it's kind of like a choreography, and we all level up together. But without exceptional soft skills on a team, this choreography isn't possible, and that's why these soft skills are so highly prized. So, how do you grow your circle of influence to have a voice in topics that matter to you, but are outside of your direct control right now? To do this, you really need to be growing your soft skills, but that's only the beginning. You should also be thinking of your own motivations, your own incentives, and the motivations and incentives of the people around you. That's where storytelling comes into the picture. Let's think again about Dropbox's levels guide. The soft skills that are valued in that guide, such as breaking down silos and building deep cross-functional relationships, these are things that a lot of us crave as accomplishments as well. After all, who doesn't like being some kind of hero that can cut through politics and accomplish something amazing? But breaking down silos and collaborating with people isn't the mission of a solo hero. It's more like being an anthropologist and studying the behavior and motivations of those around us. For instance, do we understand the incentives that drive decisions? Do we understand that a good thing happening by our own personal definition isn't the universal truth, and that a good thing for us might actually be a bad thing for someone else we work with? In the book Getting to Yes by William Ury, we can learn about some of the skills required to level up our negotiation skills enough to break down silos, and then build deep cross-functional relationships. Rather than assuming everyone who works with us all have the same mental model of what a successful outcome looks like in any given situation, William Ury guides us through research from the Harvard Negotiation Project to help us focus on the reality of negotiating with people who are maybe more powerful than us, refuse to play by the rules that we do, or even resort to dirty tricks. Thinking like a storyteller can help us to cut through all the false cliches and narratives in the workplace. Imagine we are interviewed for a bunch of interesting roles, and eventually we're recruited by a top company. Awesome. We tweet about it, the amazing title, the excellent comp. We update our LinkedIn profile as one does. The likes roll in and our endorphins start to flood out of our mind, euphoric. Then one day, the job starts. Oh no, our new team is miserable. Remember the interesting technical questions asked during the interview process? Yeah, we're not going to be inverting binary trees or optimizing the time complexity of some interesting algorithms anytime soon. Instead, we're assigned a staggering list of repetitive tasks from the backlog. So it goes. Welcome to the party, pal! Let's hear about the shape of the story from Kurt Vonnegut.
I have had a technical education, and but every time I've been on a faculty, I've been in the English department, although I've never been an English major, and I have tried to bring scientific thinking to literary criticism, and there's been very little gratitude for this. All right. Stories have very simple shapes, ones that computers can understand. This is a GI axis. Good fortune, ill fortune, death, terrible disease, poverty, boisterous good health, happiness up here. This is the BE axis, beginning, entropy. Now then, I'll give you a marketing tip. To the people who can afford educations and buying books and magazines and all that, who can read, don't like to read about people who are poor or sick. So start your story up here. Now, the simplest story, and if you stay home and watch this on television, it'll be told again and again and again. Nobody ever gets tired of this story. I call it Man in a Hole, but it needn't be about a man in a hole. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again.
Not only do people love that story, but it's like a rite of passage in technology. At some point in our career, everyone winds up in a hole like this. Sometimes these situations are all an opportunity for personal, professional growth. It's easy to crush it when conditions are perfect, but how do you handle less than ideal conditions? We're now left with two choices: work to improve the situation or work to exit the situation. If the situation is extreme, maybe the latter is the best option. But without soft skills to help us navigate this hole, we may stay paralyzed and do nothing. But there's a bright side. Keep in mind that the shape of a story, person in a hole, is impossible without some kind of redemption after the struggle. This redemption is what makes the story so compelling. I'm not advocating that everyone needs to struggle, but I think it's realistic to assume that any role exists in a professional software development context that doesn't involve some sort of struggle or challenge. But with enough effort, patience, skill, negativity can turn around, and in some rare cases even lead to the most positive outcomes of our careers. But life isn't always fair. Sometimes it might seem impossible to break out of a hole because there's such a strong incentive for the hole to exist. As we discussed earlier when mentioning the book Getting to Yes and the power of understanding personal incentives, there's a particularly sinister situation that I call compression, in which forces are so completely stacked against a person or a team because incentives are just too strong for the status quo to stop. Literally, breaking out of a hole is impossible because those in a position of power have so much to gain from the current state. Unfortunately, in certain cases, the correct solution won't win. In these cases, someone either needs to remain patient, wait for circumstances to change, or just find a new path. But thankfully, I think these situations are pretty rare. And even then, a skilled leadership team should be able to spot these issues before they take hold, especially in a startup environment where politics shouldn't be the driving force of technical decisions. How do we start thinking like a storyteller so we can recognize and adapt to these shapes as they happen in our careers without having to just quit when things get tough? In Robert McKee's book Story, he encourages writers to think of a scene in the same way that a developer might think of a function. Each scene starts out with some kind of state, and then different events and decisions shape that state. Hypothetically, let's talk about Peter. Peter's at work and depressed. Then an event happens, which changes Peter's mood from depressed to angry. A state-changing event might be that Peter's learned his friends were laid off, even though they worked harder than him, which is super unfair. We then chain these scenes together like we chain functions together. If we cut through the noise and break down inputs and outputs of a story in the most simple way possible, we can make sense of larger narrative arcs at play. Like, Peter finds happiness by quitting software development and becomes a construction worker. But without the drive to improve a bad situation, even if the change feels extreme, we're led into a different story shape. What might have happened if Peter stayed at Initech? Would he have been turned into Lumberg? Let's call this shape the cockroach.
There's a Franz Kafka story. Very pessimistic. Starts down here. There's this rather unattractive, not particularly nice looking, not very personable young man who has a really lousy job and disagreeable relatives. And so it's time for him to go to work again. and he has turned into a cockroach.
Let's think about what happens if we don't intervene when someone on our team, or multiple people on our team, fall into a hole. When a story arc like person in a hole becomes the norm rather than the exception, the more extreme the fix must be to help reshape the story. The cockroach arc might start playing out more and more and more because a company looks for the easiest solution first. In proactive companies, techniques like the Westrum Culture Index might be used to help measure a lack of engagement, more specifically in the context of a technology culture. The Westrum Culture Index is a formal model of DevOps culture based on research from Dr. Ron Westrum and DORA, the DevOps Research Association. Looking at DORA's research, they literally draw a line from soft skill-driven outcomes like transformational leadership to hard skills and hard technical outcomes like technical practices, and from culture and work environment to software delivery and operational performance. According to the DORA model, there's no way to decouple these seemingly non-technical outcomes like autonomy, trust, and voice from things like organizational performance. In many ways, being intentional about appreciating the art of storytelling equips us to think about research like DORA in a way that makes it a little more intuitive. Now that you understand some basics of storytelling and some of the motivations for focusing on the soft skills of technical work, I'll leave you with a word of warning, along with some practical advice. While studying storytelling and working on our soft skills might make us feel like we can analyze any situation and come to know the truth, Vonnegut leaves us with a consideration to ponder. When discussing the shape of Shakespeare's masterpiece Hamlet, Vonnegut gives us an important warning about analyzing the shapes of stories. For those who might not remember Hamlet, let's recap. Hamlet is the story of the son of a king. When the story begins, we learn that Hamlet's father, the king, has died, and his mother has remarried Hamlet's own uncle, Claudius. So Hamlet is as depressed as Cinderella was at the beginning of her own story. One day, Hamlet's friend Horatio tells him about this thing wandering on the parapet that he should go and talk to. Hamlet listens to his friend and goes up to the parapet. The thing that Horatio spoke of appears to be the ghost of Hamlet's father, the recently deceased king. The ghost tells Hamlet that his own brother, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, robbed him of his royal title, his wife, and his soul's eternal rest. Let's hear what Kurt Vonnegut has to say about Hamlet's trip to the parapet.
And this thing, whatever it is, now we don't know. Is any of you who've horsed around with Ouija boards or with any sort of seances or anything, you know there are malicious spirits around who are looking for saps like you, who are going to find ways to hurt you, give you very bad advice. So to this day, we do not know whether that thing up there on the parapet was really the ghost of his father and whether it was telling him the truth.
Hamlet is quick to believe the ghost because the spirit's words confirm Hamlet's own worst fear, that his uncle murdered his father to steal the throne. The ghost of the king wants Hamlet to avenge his death so he can escape purgatory. So Hamlet obliges, and after dawdling around for 4 acts, finally kills his uncle Claudius in the 5th. Oh yeah, and Hamlet dies too after being wounded by a poisoned sword in a duel. So it goes. So why is Hamlet considered a masterpiece if its story shape is just a straight line? Let's hear what Vonnegut says.
We are so seldom told the truth. And in Hamlet, Shakespeare tells us. We don't know enough about life to know what the good news is and the bad news is, and we respond to that.
So, while it's important to think like a storyteller, it's also important to understand that you might not be able to see the truth of any given situation right away. It can be hard to know what the good parts are and what the bad parts are without additional context. That being said, I still think there's a huge value to caring about your own story and the story of those around you. This type of caring and understanding can help you unlock new heights in your own career and help lift up those around you. The reason intentional communication is so important is that without it, we're basically broadcasting without receiving. So remember to listen attentively and actively care about what you're hearing. Otherwise, there's really no way to learn about the stories of those around you. I'll wrap up with a few pieces of practical advice that you can take or leave. It's really up to you. The next time you're struggling, analyze the situation and write up a proposal. Even if you keep it to yourself for a little while, this will help you to analyze yourself and your own thoughts critically. Think of the shape of the current story and what impact your proposal might have on the narrative arc you see in front of you. If you feel strongly about a correct solution, but those around you aren't feeling it, challenge yourself to consider a few alternate approaches, while keeping all of the various incentives and motivations of those around you in mind. Do your best, but remember that if a situation isn't working, just recognize it and act. Try to avoid turning into a cockroach. A final piece of advice is for those of you in leadership roles. If you're in a position of influence, actively listen to those around you, ask for different viewpoints, and hey, consider hiring more technologists from an arts background. You might be surprised what technologists with the love of the arts can bring to a technical team. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, I highly recommend reading a few works of Vonnegut. Consider starting with Slaughterhouse 5. I've also linked Vonnegut's entire lecture in the description below, along with links to some of the books that I've recommended so far. Remember, keep dark mode on, because nobody wants to work with light mode coders. Stay tuned for the next video.